Welcome to the Chapter 7 lecture on political violence and essentials of comparative politics. This chapter is about political violence outside the control of states. Violence carried out by states was the subject of the previous chapter on non-democratic regimes, and violence between states is usually a subject for international politics and international relations courses. A key theme is that violence by non-state actors can take several forms, that it can be explained by referring to institutions, ideology, and individual personalities, and that responding to violence presents a dilemma for modern states. So what is political violence? The state is the cornerstone of modern politics, and it's expected that the state should hold a monopoly of violence over a territory. Political violence, therefore, is outside of this typical state monopoly on violence. So we're going to focus on political violence, which differs from crime, for example. While some of the activities may be similar to crime, the motivation is significantly different. Political violence is violence carried out for the purpose of achieving some policy or a political goal. Crime may be carried out for economic reasons or because a perpetrator enjoys violence, but it lacks a specific political goal. Contentious politics can also include nonviolent activities such as sit-ins, but for this chapter, we're focusing only on violent forms of political contention. So why political violence? Why do some people, but not others, engage in political violence? Why do they engage in violence only in some places and at some times? These are all good questions that political scientists have tried to study. Details on the three kinds of explanations follow in the next few slides: institutional, ideational, and individual. If the question is, why do some people engage in violence but others do not, then we need to account for some variation. Institutional arguments are based on the premise that institutions vary more than things such as grievances, so that if we want to understand the causes of revolution, for example, we need to look at institutions. Some research on civil wars has linked presidential systems and systems that use winner-take-all rules, such as plurality systems, to more violence. In these systems, minorities may be permanently denied access to power, which may lead them to turn to violence as a means of correcting this exclusion. For this reason, many scholars suggest using either proportional representation or preferential voting systems in multi-ethnic societies, as this allows a greater representation of voices. Ideational simply means having to do with ideas. The impact of ideas depends on context. Ideas that are radical or reactionary within their society are more likely to lead people to reject existing institutions and seek to replace them with new ones. Some types of ideologies may be especially prone to encouraging violence. For instance, groups such as ISIS or Boko Haram in Africa, in Nigeria, use religious fundamentalism to justify violence against non-Muslims. Every major religion has produced fundamentalists willing to engage in violence. The 969 movement is a Buddhist national movement in Myanmar or Burma, and Christian fundamentalism is a major element in white supremacist violence in the United States today. And one example would be the Oklahoma City bombing in the 1990s. Somewhat related, millenariist religions are those that posit an upcoming end of the world, which allows them to justify extreme behavior. A Japanese group used poison gas in the Tokyo subway, was an example of this type of group. Broad ideas outside of religion can be powerful motivators. To maintain stability, states rely on the idea of legitimacy, meaning that people accept that it is right and proper for the state or regime to rule. When states lack legitimacy, people feel that they have the right to rebel against it. Please note that this argument does not contradict institutional or individual theories. Rather, these ideational conditions can combine with them to make violence even more likely or perhaps even unlikely. Individual explanations focus on individual decision making. These explanations may focus on personal experiences or apply more general human cognition processes to explain personal motivations. Most people who study political violence argue that rather than a cognitively deviant act, it reflects a rational cost-benefit analysis that the person has. Maybe not from our personal point of view, but from the point of view of the person engaging in the violence, that would be the case. For instance, socioeconomic experiences may create feelings of desperation, a desire for liberation, or social solidarity with a group or a cause, which in turn may motivate violence. For instance, the event that sparked the Arab Spring was the self-immolation of a fruit vendor in Tunisia named Mohamed Bouazizi. By all accounts, Bouazizi was driven by frustration with his economic circumstances and by the humiliating treatment given to him by government authorities, which ultimately led him to set himself on fire. Fitting with the rational actor approach, other people who engage in political violence may be doing so for economic reasons. For instance, many ISIS fighters from developing countries such as Tunisia may be fighting in the Middle East for economic reasons, as the $150 a day they are offered is much better than any economic opportunities that they have at home. So as we look at explanations for political violence, this chapter really covers institutional, ideational, and individual forms as explanation for the reasoning behind the actions taken in political violence. So let's compare explanations of political violence. These three explanations vary on whether human action is up to personal choice, like free will, or whether it is shaped by larger structures beyond individual control. Determinism is what we would call that. Institutional explanations, because they believe people's actions are shaped and directed by larger structures that they do not control, are the most deterministic. Individual explanations, which emphasize individual choice in response to personal experiences, are the least deterministic, most oriented toward this notion of free will. Ideational explanations really fall between these two. The three explanations also vary on whether human action is shaped by a unique combination of institutions, or whether the conditions would universally apply to different people, the comparison of particularistic versus the universal. While these explanations may vary greatly, it is important to remember that if we want to explain why political violence occurs and predict outbreaks of potential future violence, it is better to use all three explanations at the same time. Institutional explanations tend to be more particularistic, stressing the unique combination and role of institutions in a given case that is not easily generalized and applied elsewhere. Individual explanations are certainly more universal, typically centering on personal or psychological attributes common to all humans that can lead anyone to violence. Again, ideational falls between the two other approaches. Demonstrating how these three approaches should be thought of as complementary rather than competing explanations, the description of the Syrian conflict at the start of this chapter can be understood through these three approaches. Institutional approach: the Syrian regime under Assad was highly patrimonial, with a monopoly of power held by the Assad family and the minority Alawite sect. Most of the population was denied access to power. The Sunni population in particular had been predisposed to protest in the 1980s. Protests by this population led to a brutal crackdown by the Assad regime, leaving the message that peaceful, contentious activities would not be tolerated. Ideational approaches would suggest that with support from foreign actors such as Saudi Arabia, one of the largest militant groups to emerge following the initial protest was the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. ISIS, we normally refer to it as, was a group that was built on the remnants of the former terrorist group Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This group conducted a brutal campaign against the government and against more moderate elements in the insurgency, often with more focus on the moderate insurgency itself, with the goal of creating their own state governed by severe religious law. If we take it from an individual approach, the initial protests prior to the escalation of violence were motivated by people frustrated with the regime's corruption and with rising housing costs, principally. When the government responded to these protests by firing on the crowds and torturing protesters and imprisoning dissidents, the initial peaceful protests quickly descended into violence against the regime. Let's look at forms of political violence. Riots, assassinations, and civil wars are all examples of political violence. We focus on two, revolution and terrorism, because of their substantive importance. Notice that in both cases, this form of political violence is carried out by individual citizens, not by government agents. The second similarity, if we look at the chapter section on terrorism and revolution, means and ends, is that both revolution and terrorism seek to replace or abolish existing economic and political institutions. Given that both forms of violence seek revolutionary change, it is perhaps unsurprising that the two events are often linked together. In fact, the first terrorists were part of Robespierre's Régime de la Terreur during the French Revolution. Mass uprisings, even if they don't result in regime change, can profoundly change politics, making it worth studying. Terrorism may be less likely to result in profound political change, but it does represent a major challenge to modern political institutions, and because of that, it is worth studying. Revolution is not just the replacement of the government, the people who inhabit offices at the time, but of the entire regime. So not just the government changes, but often the regime type, going from a democratic form to a non-democratic form, or a non-democratic form to a democratic form. Since so many revolutions have involved violence, people sometimes assume that it is a defining element of revolution. However, the East European revolutions that overthrew communism in 1989 were largely peaceful. It was really only Romania that experienced any significant violence. Violence, therefore, represents a choice. It occurs if the current regime decides to use force to stay in power, or if the revolutionary forces decide to use violence to achieve their desired change. It is important to keep in mind that not all regime changes are revolutions. Coup d'etat, because it is a regime overthrow by a small group, is not a revolution. Negotiated transitions, like South Africa, are also elite-driven, so scholars hesitate to call it revolution. Finally, secessionist movements who seek either more local control or complete independence from a state would not be considered a revolution because they are not seeking to gain control of the central government. Pages 221 to 224 of this chapter describe three phases of scholarly work on the causes of revolution. The first phase, which the book discusses briefly, didn't yield any important insights because it mostly focused on describing specific revolutions and didn't offer any broader explanations or patterns. The first phase and its approaches are largely ignored by modern scholars of revolution. The theories that emerged out of phase two, the relative deprivation, which is an individual approach, and phase three, the institutional approach, have been updated and reapplied to modern political violence studies over and over again. And those approaches and their main arguments will be covered in the following slides. As discussed in the text, different theories and explanations have dominated the field at different times. Today, scholars try to integrate multiple approaches to understanding when and why revolution occurs. Relative deprivation theories developed out of social movements research try to explain motivators for broad collective action. It argues that people seek to change the system when they are frustrated with the status quo. As it focuses on individual motivation, it should be grouped with individual explanations rather than ideational or institutional for political violence. Under this approach, revolution may emerge under the following two conditions. First, if modernization rapidly changes a society, oftentimes the political system fails to keep up with the population's changing expectations, failing to provide the policy goals and goods or political rights this population has come to expect. When some people are benefiting more from the state than others, this is the relative part of the deprivation theory. Individuals need some group to which they compare themselves, the group that creates the expectation of how things should be. So if a small elite, whether that's elites that are ethnic or racial or class as a basis, is doing much better than others economically or politically, the masses may mobilize to challenge this privileged elite. So some revolutions seem to fit with relative deprivation explanations. So Iran during the 1970s is a good example where rapid development under the Shah led to greater demands for political freedom. Similarly, Egypt's revolution seemed to have been triggered in great part by high youth unemployment and the frustrations that that created. However, other countries, Japan and now possibly even China, have achieved significant social and economic change without triggering a widespread revolution, suggesting that this model is really a poor predictor of regime stability. A second approach is represented by Theda Skopal's famous work, State and Social Revolutions. In it, she argues that revolutions require a specific set of conditions. First, she argues competition with rival states can betray state weakness. Second, weaker states may seek to institute reform to increase their autonomy or their capacity, but these reforms can challenge existing power structures and sow discord within the regime itself. An example of a revolution triggered by institutional factors would be France in 1789. War with England led to higher taxes and centralization, triggering revolt. And similarly, Russia's revolution was made possible by the failure of the Tsarist Russian regime in World War I. However, institutional approaches also have poor prediction issues. In particular, it ignores the role of ideas and individuals making revolution happen. The fall of communism in Eastern Europe was triggered by changes in the international arena, especially the Soviet Union's losing control, and internal failures within each state. But it was also inspired by opposition leaders strongly influenced by the ideas of liberalism, of human rights, and of nonviolent protest. Similarly, the Arab Spring was inspired by the actions of one man, Mohammed Bouazizi, whose self-immolation resonated strongly with Arab populations, leading to protests across the Arab world demanding dignity and political reform from within inside their own states. So if we take a look at the institutions in action section feature at the end of the chapter for how these forces played a role in the Arab Spring, there are really actually two interesting questions posed by the section. Why do these revolutions occur in the 2010-2011 time period? And why did Tunisia's revolution lead to peaceful democratic regime change while other movements such as that in Egypt and Syria led to retaliation or a retaliatory state violence and revolution failure? To start with the first question, why 2011? An institutional approach would suggest that the Arab world in 2011 was comprised of some of the most repressive and exclusionary regimes in modern politics. Relating to Skopal's States and Social Revolutions, some of these authoritarian regimes had actually undergone recent reforms. Most notably, Syria's Assad regime had liberalized their economy and political system, but widespread drought from the 2006 to 2010 years exacerbated socioeconomic differences within the country. Ideational approaches would look at groups like the April 6th movement in Egypt shaping the message of the protests. They focused on issues of regime corruption, loss of dignity being one of them, and took their inspiration from successful protest movements in Eastern Europe. These movements also copied each other. When the April 6th movement saw Tunisia's protesters bring down their government, they launched their own protests, ultimately unseating Mubarak's dictatorship. From an individual approach, these events were sparked by the actions of one individual, Bouazizi of Tunisia. In December of 2010, Bouazizi, this 26-year-old working as a fruit seller, stood before the local governor's office and doused himself in gasoline and set himself on fire. Fitting with relative deprivation approaches, Bouazizi's experience resonated with the masses in Tunisia. Many youth felt especially frustrated by the lack of jobs and the failings of these governments. Protests began soon thereafter and spread across the whole region, raising common demands for dignity and for change. The other major question discussed in the textbook section is why Tunisia's revolution led to a peaceful democratic transition until recent economic hardships destabilized the regime. But while the rest of the regime at the time of the Arab Spring saw violence emerge and non-democracy actually strengthened. Egypt had a brief regime change that ended in a military coup, while Syria completely devolved into civil war. The revolutions that became violent had a few common features. Regimes with stronger militaries and more patrimonial systems like Syria and Egypt responded to challenges to their power by repressing the population. While Tunisia, that had a weaker military, Syria in particular had both the desire, the means to use violence against their opponents. In Tunisia, they did not have that desire, nor did they have the military strength to do so. Countries with more moderate elements, like Tunisia, had all actors supporting democratic reforms, such as Tunisia's Islamicist Ennahda party. In comparison, more fundamentalist voices, Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, for example, polarized the population and made the public more accepting, at least temporarily, of the military coup in Egypt. Political leaders of these movements chose to either compromise, like they did in Tunisia, or escalate in response to state violence, as they did in Syria, and which broke down then into the Syrian civil war. While terrorists might be inspired to create a revolution, the research also shows that a revolution based on violence does not pay off. Most attempts at violent regime change lead to non-democratic outcomes. Again, nonviolent action is associated with more democracy after the event. Too often, revolutionary leaders reject democracy because of democracy's need for compromise, and they see it as incompatible with their goal of social transformation. Egypt, Cuba, Russia, China, France, and Iran are all examples of countries whose populations hoped for democracy in their revolutions, but instead received a repressive dictatorship. This repression may be internal or external, as some research suggests that countries that have recently undergone failed revolutions, may be more likely to attack other countries, perhaps out of a desire of the regime to find convenient enemies to rally their population against and bring them back under control. However, protest movements that embrace nonviolent tactics are much more successful at producing democratic reforms. A good example is Serbia's Otpor movement, which was a student movement that brought down the Milosevic dictatorship. Members of this group have created an international nonprofit called Canvas, which helps train protesters in other non-democracies. Furthermore, cross-national research finds a similar trend. One study examined 323 attempts at regime change from 1900 to 2006 and found that violent campaigns succeeded 26% of the time, while nonviolent campaigns led to regime change 53% of the time. In addition, research shows that regime changes imposed from the top, such as through a ruling elite or through external intervention, are less successful than those with a widespread societal involvement. In fact, the larger the protest within the society, the more likely the transition will, in fact, be democratic. While there are many definitions of terrorism, the book's definition reflects one that is used by the U.S. State Department and a number of terrorism scholars. State-sponsored terrorism may have state funding of a group, but the actual organization and the membership of those groups are non-state actors. For instance, Pakistan funds non-state proxy groups such as Jaish-e-Mohammed, JEM, to carry out attacks against India. Related to the intent of terrorism, which is to cause fear or terror, the victims of a terrorist attack are often not in the intended audience of the violence. Terrorists instead carry out their attacks to influence governments, societal groups, or other citizens than those that are harmed in terrorist attacks. Global terrorist violence peaked around 2015. Most of this violence has occurred in places like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, and the Philippines. While we tend to focus on deaths that emerge from terrorism incidents, according to the data from the Global Terrorism Database, over half of terrorism attacks are non-lethal, and most deadly attacks kill only a handful of people. Some groups, such as the Earth Liberation Front, ELF, prefer to target businesses or property rather than people. So their attacks have a low lethality, or few to no people die because of their attacks. Terrorism is often considered a war crime, since targeting civilians is a violation of international standards of warfare tactics. But not one where an agent of a state is the perpetrator. That's the problem with terrorism. So usually, but not always, the definition used in war crimes tribunals are meant for states rather than for terrorist organizations. In figure 7.2, the chart distinguishes types of political violence based on the target of the attack and the actor carrying out the attack. So this chart can help you better understand which actions are defined as acts of terrorism and which ones are not. Institutional, ideational, and individual explanations for terrorism are both useful and problematic. Evidence shows that terrorist groups tend to be oriented around specific goals and that they are not simply driven by extreme religious views, an intrinsic love of violence, or personal humiliation and despair. In fact, most terrorist groups engage in well-coordinated strategies to try to coerce changes from their targets. If we think of them as rational actors, as we do to states in the international arena, then the causes of this violence are possible to predict. While some people sometimes cite poverty and a lack of education as triggers for terrorism, the reality is that terrorist leaders are often wealthier and more educated than the rest of the population of their home country. The quote-unquote frustrated elite seems a typical pattern in terrorist recruits around the world. As a result, weak economics is a poor predictor of terrorism. Political explanations do a slightly better job predicting terrorism. Terrorism is more likely in states with weak capacity and autonomy. In addition, some scholars have argued that terrorism is more likely in hybrid, illiberal regimes, ones with weak participatory cultures. Terrorism is less common in democracies and full autocracies or non-democracies. In democracies, it's argued that these states allow nonviolent outlets for frustration, mobilizing in protest and peaceful assembly. In fully non-democratic states, terrorism may be less common, either because the regime cracks down hard on terrorists, increasing the risk of this activity perhaps, or because the regime does not report terrorism out of fear of losing public legitimacy. While some analysts have blamed terrorism on specific ideologies, religions, or a set of values, terrorist groups span many religions and ideologies, so this doesn't really offer a good causal explanation of terrorist violence. Instead, some argue that what is more important is when those ideas connect with what we call nihilism. Nihilism can be combined with utopian views, arguing that violence is necessary to destroy or purify a corrupt world. In explaining Europe's recent outbreak of terrorism, French political scientist Olivier Roy argues that nihilism is one of the defining features, as nearly all the perpetrators are European-born, second-generation immigrants with little previous religious affiliation prior to their radicalization. He writes this in his article in The Guardian, Who Are the New Jihadis? Worth checking out. However, we might question whether certain ideas really cause terrorist violence. Religious justifications, in particular, are often used by perpetrators, sometimes even after the fact, to delegitimize their opponents or justify their own activities. In other words, the violence is caused by other factors, and things such as ideology and religious beliefs are added later as a justification for those actions to make the terrorist actions look more honorable or sympathetic to the audience. When examining the personal motivations of terrorist groups, scholars, some of them anyway, focus on individual feelings, especially alienation or humiliation, that often drives radicalization. Other scholars take a more rational actor approach, focusing on the cost-benefit analysis of why an individual would engage in the high-risk behavior of terrorism. In answering this question, these scholars point out that belonging to a terrorist group can convey material or non-material benefits to a member. Starting with non-material, group membership can provide a sense of belonging, which is especially appealing to individuals at the fringes of society. And we shouldn't discount that terrorist organizations do pay their members. While evidence shows that terrorist groups rarely achieve dramatic change in the existing domestic or international order, which they claim to work for, they can have a significant political and economic impact. Terrorists can make governments look incompetent by making them seem unable to provide security. They also call attention to unresolved issues. Enough terrorist activities can so damage economic, social, and political institutions that they can trigger government collapse, especially in countries with an already weak state capacity. And as the book discusses, terrorist groups may seek to use their violence to inspire others to join the cause. They may hope to do this by triggering a state over-response to their violence. In essence, terrorism might be carried out by a few individuals whose hope is that the state will crack down indiscriminately against the population. And if the state does this, then more people are likely to be frustrated by the government. Moderates, or at least those willing to compromise with the government, are then discredited. And the extremist logic that violence is the only solution to the state's failings gains more support. In other words, terrorist groups may be a form of nascent insurgent or guerrilla movements. Terrorist and revolution. Let's look at that as a means and an end. For revolutionary leaders like Maximilien de Robespierre, terror was an essential part of revolution. Keep in mind that terrorism of Robespierre was state-run, which is a bit different than modern definitions of terrorism. Over time, revolutionaries shifted their thinking. Terrorism ceased being a means of governing and instead a strategy of achieving revolution. Terrorists rarely seek limited goals, such as political or economic reform, since they see the entire political system as illegitimate. Rather, they believe that through their seemingly indiscriminate use of violence, all dominant institutions can be shattered and remade. Terrorist groups and guerrilla war groups may share revolutionary goals, but some of their beliefs and behaviors are distinct. Some of these differences are driven by strategic calculations, others by political goals. So, guerrilla war groups tend to abide by the traditional rules of war. They avoid targeting civilians and accept that their opponents and the international community are legitimate. Terrorists do not share these features. These groups, it leads these groups to be more violent and less accepting of compromise. Let's look at political violence in religion. As religion has reemerged in the public realm, it has been accompanied by fundamentalism. The institutional and ideational factors that can transform religious belief into a motivator for violence include: one, anti-modernization, or a fear of rapid social change that undermines existing social and political connections. Two, a belief in a cosmic war that leads to dehumanization of enemies. Easier to overcome inhibitions about killing if religious doctrine can be used to explain why opponents are ungodly or subhuman. Three, a utopian or messianic idea. If the end of the world is coming soon, the stakes are higher. Purifying the world becomes urgent. So this combination of these three factors can push fundamentalism into extreme forms. It causes members to reinterpret the faith in a way that divorces it from its mainstream foundations. Many fundamentalists of Muslim, Christian, and other faiths would view the radical views of terrorists with horror, seeing them as far removed from their faith. In fact, it may be argued that fundamentalists have more in common with other fundamentalists in different religions than with members of their own religion. All religions have their terrorists. If we look at Islam, Al Qaeda, and ISIS, Christianity has its own, and those who are inspired. And of course, even Buddhism, which is considered to be a peaceful, the most peaceful religion, still has its own problems with terrorist groups. Let's talk about countering political violence. While the following slides focus on the specifics of terrorism risks and counterterrorism activities in democracies, this In Focus feature offers a general introduction to the link between regime type and terrorism risk. So the regime type of authoritarian or democratic or illiberal or transitional, and the kind of terrorism, the result of these regimes. So take a look at this In Focus in your book. We can break non-democracies into the fully autocratic, pure non-democracy versus illiberal regimes discussed in the non-democracy chapter. While autocratic regimes are at a low risk of terrorism, hybrid regimes are the most prone to actual terrorist violence. Autocracies might actually experience less terrorism because their media control allows them to hide events. Research by a number of media academics, like Nemeth and Moslin, find that terrorism data is less accurate in countries with a closed media. Democracies are significantly less prone to political violence. Controlling for other explanations, they are less likely to experience civil war, terrorism, or revolution. The main reason for this may be their functioning political participation, which allows societal actors nonviolent outlets for frustration. In other words, insurgent groups and terrorist groups are less likely to even emerge in democracies. At the same time, the freedom that exists in a democracy may enable global actors to carry out violence in those societies. The ISIS attacks on Europe, such as the 2016 Paris attack, or, of course, the United States September 11 attack on New York City and Washington, D.C., are good examples of transnational terrorism impacting democracies. When this violence emerges, democracies may face the choice of sacrificing political freedoms to increase their security. Finding the balance between freedom and security is a major challenge. The three countries on this slide, and discussed in your book, have responded to the political violence in their country with policies that limit civil liberties, such as the right to privacy and other legal rights. The United States passed the Patriot Act after September 11th, which massively increased the ability of the U.S. government to spy on the population. This surveillance state was expanded and may have violated the Constitution with the discovery of warrantless wiretapping by the National Security Agency, the NSA. It was a secret program that was leaked to the news by former CIA contractor Edward Snowden. It's important to emphasize that these programs apply to suspected terrorists. A person does not have to actually be convicted of terrorism in a court for his or her civil liberties to be ignored. Their goal has been to improve security, but critics argue that these sorts of policies can undermine individual rights, therefore risking core democratic freedoms. To quote U.S. founding father Benjamin Franklin, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. In addition, some critics argue that harsher policies, such as the French and UK policies that suspended legal rights, may actually prove counterproductive. They may undermine state legitimacy and isolate vulnerable populations, thereby increasing feelings of alienation and fueling recruitment into radical groups. Political violence, especially violence by non-state actors, is a major challenge for modern states. It's difficult to predict when it will occur, and preventing it is nearly impossible. As your chapter concludes, countries need to balance prevention, such as providing democratic institutions and opportunities for political contention, with treatment, such as military and legal methods to counter terrorism, keeping in mind that treatments can come with their own risks. So, different explanations for political violence focus on the role of institutions, ideas, and individual characteristics, and these approaches are important. Revolution and terrorism are two distinct but related forms of political violence. Terrorists seldom get what they want, policy-wise, but their actions do significantly impact the state where they carry out the attacks. And under certain conditions, any religious belief can motivate political violence. And this is true in any nation in the world and among all the world's major religions. Democracy and non-democracies rely on different tactics. Participation versus repression to reduce terrorism. Illiberal regimes who lack either option are really at the highest risk for terrorism. They have a much harder time cracking down and repressing dissident voices and covering up potential terrorism or terrorist acts in the media, while democracies, of course, give that outlet for people to blow off steam, to engage in elections and participate, but also to engage their civil rights and peacefully protest. So for democracies, counterterrorism policies may present a trade-off between security and freedom as well, trying to balance our civil rights and liberties with the need for state security.